Thank you so much for those kind words. I am really delighted to have this opportunity to address the 2014 Salish Sea Conference. Delighted? Yes. But truth be told, I have another, more gleeful reaction. Someone has finally asked me to step outside the confines of science and contemplate the future. Undoubtedly, you are sitting there wondering, exactly how does this hardcore scientist, a guy like this guy, get asked to pontificate about the future? That is really a good question. Here's the inside story. Someone from the program committee, someone you knew long ago, calls early on Monday morning and begins praising whatever can be found worth praising about your professional record. Then, eventually, asks, and I'm quoting here more or less, "Hey, Bob, want to give a keynote talk at the next Salish Sea conference? We'll have dozens and dozens of scientific talks, but we also want somebody who isn't afraid to drag us away from our professional comfort zones. Someone to place all this scientific stuff in a larger context. Someone to provoke us a bit. I'm hoping that you would be willing to play that role for us." How would you respond to such a clever pitch? I accepted, and accepted with enthusiasm. So here I am, your designated provoker, a scientist tasked with playing the role of a provocateur. Okay, let's get to the program committee's assignment. First, forget about 2020 or 2030. The challenge facing the Salish Sea requires a much longer time horizon. Think out to 2100 and beyond. Second, the Salish Sea is mostly what we talk about here, but its future is largely driven by what happens on Salish land, the name I'm applying for the watersheds that surround the Salish Sea. What plays out on Salish land over the next 86 years and beyond 2100 will both drive and constrain the policy options for the sea. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to describe 4 fundamental realities that will circumscribe the ecological future of the Salish Sea. The first reality that clearly circumscribes the future of the Salish Sea is obvious. I'm sure they would be at the top of your list. The first reality is that through this century, the growth of the human population in Salish land will both drive and constrain the future of the Salish Sea. I realize that I'm now straying into territory chock full of landmines. As one of my oldest and dearest colleagues always cautions me, and I'll clean up his language a bit. Quote, "Bob, you are absolutely right. Most people already know this, and that's exactly why you should let it rest. Back off. You'll leave the environmental activists in the audience depressed. Worse, you'll have the scientists wondering why you are pontificating on the intuitively obvious. And, most disconcerting, you run the risk of being attacked by everyone else as being a racist, nativist, xenophobe, cultural imperialist, or, at the very least, an economic elitist. Take my advice. Let it go." Undoubtedly very sensible and safe advice. Sensible and safe, yes. But the fact is that if society wishes to do anything meaningful about changing the long-term trajectory for the Salish Sea ecosystems, then something must be done about the unrelenting growth in the number of humans in Salish land. Let me be clear. As a scientist, I'm not arguing that society collectively ought to change current U.S. or Canadian population policy. But the simple fact is that the anticipated growth of the human population in Salish land is a serious barrier, a showstopper, a colossal impediment to achieving the ecological goals that I have heard being pitched at this conference. Demographers call this region fill-in country because most of the future population growth will be driven by people moving here, migration, not reproduction. For nearly 2 centuries, migration has been the main population driver in Salish land. Thus, the annual growth rates for this region continue to be much higher than for the rest of the United States or Canada. But let me get specific. Assuming government policy regarding migration remains unchanged, then the population of Salish land, currently 9 million, in 2100 will be 25 to 30 million. You heard me right. 9 million today, 25 to 30 million in 2100. A tripling or more. These added millions of people will demand houses, apartments, hotels, schools, tennis courts, sports stadiums, roads, airplanes, trains, Walmarts, electricity, drinking water, pipelines, super tankers, ski resorts, McDonald's, Starbucks. And for the Canadians out there, add to my list Tim Hortons, Canadian Tire, and superstores. It will be a long list. You can fill in the subsequent ecological effects. Think European population densities. My take-home message from this first reality is simple. If society really wishes to do anything meaningful about altering the long-term ecological trajectory of the Salish Sea, then the population trajectory must change, and change dramatically. Okay, that was the first reality, the growth of the human population in this region. And it was an easy one. Let's now move to a second, but less obvious policy driver. The second reality is that proposed public policies in Salish land that are seen to cause a reduced standard of living are not politically viable. After several decades of interacting professionally with the public, I have concluded, albeit reluctantly, that most people talk a great game when it comes to ecological and environmental issues, but talking rarely implies a genuine willingness to change. After all, who isn't supportive of something like, quote, a future that assures the health and well-being of our ecological life support system? It will poll 90% plus. This is essentially unanimous support, right? Well, at least 90% plus support until people are told about the required costs, the trade-offs, the sacrifices. In other words, achieving that goal would result in a reduced standard of living. Once understood, the commitment by most people falls dramatically. More directly, over my career, I observed that most people simply will not accept a proposed policy that is seen as resulting in a reduced standard of living. There are a few exceptions for sure, but most people, more importantly for most voters, it is a non-starter. And people who want to get elected know this political reality. As a scientist, I'm not here to sermonize about this situation, but rather to acknowledge its existence. In short, it reminds me of what we tell our children when they whine about something in life just not being fair. As parents, we say, it is what it is, deal with it. To those trying to predict the most likely future of the Salish Sea, and to those trying to alter current ecological trajectories, I offer the same advice. Remember what your parents said. It is what it is, deal with it. And if that is not a tough pill to swallow, don't forget about what economists call intergenerational welfare programs. To stave off financial insolvency, intergenerational welfare programs such as Social Security, Medicare, and their Canadian equivalents require a growing economy and therefore a growing population. So whatever environmental or ecological policy are proposed by advocates, they will have to be pitched as ones that encourage economic growth because there is negligible voter support for a reduced standard of living. Now let's move to reality 3. Okay, we've identified 2 of the 4 realities for the future of the Salish Sea. Now I want to move to a reality that is front and center both at this conference and in the mass media. Reality 3. Third reality is changing climate, as uncertain as it might be to fully understand, has and will alter the ecological dynamics of both the Salish Sea and Salish land. To me, most of the public debate about climate change seems to be fixated on resolving how much of the temperature increase or the rate of the increase over the past 150 years is due to human actions. Interesting questions, but looking at the past 2,000 years for the more important ecological context, there have been centuries of relative cold and centuries of relative warm. Climate has never been static. In short, select any century. The reality is that the so-called normal climate really didn't exist. It is so easy to slip into the view that climate change that we have seen for the past century or two is normal, the baseline from which deviations are both unexpected and inherently undesirable. But why use the current situation as the baseline? Is the notion of a climate baseline even appropriate in ecology? Was growing wine grapes in England during the medieval warm period, that is from around 900 to 1300 AD, was that normal or an aberration? Wine grapes haven't grown in England for 800 years, although they are now making a comeback back as temperatures gradually rise. Were the decade-long California mega droughts of the 1500s normal or an aberration? These droughts 500 years ago dwarfs the ones we had in the 1930s. What about the past 150 years in California? They have generally been relatively wet compared to the past 2,000 years. So which century is normal? Why would anyone expect climate to stop changing? The understandable tendency to prattle on about the need but contentious adaptations to climate change. But how much does society move past the increasingly quaint notions of the so-called natural ecosystems, the supposedly native species? More specifically, think about the core ecological foundation of the U.S. Endangered Species Act or the Canadian Species at Risk Act. The implicit premise is a reasonably stable climate. So, if society is realistic in demanding that bureaucrats keep trying to hang on to species that are not simply viable with a changing climate, is that realistic? Indeed, this very unpleasant question is unpleasant to contemplate. But ultimately, of course, it is at the core of a political question. Informed by science, yes, but in the end requires tough choices by the public from among competing and nasty policy trade-offs. So in short, climates have changed in the past and they will change in the future. And this reality will, in part, circumscribe the future of both Salish land and the Salish Sea. Now let's look at reality 4. The fourth and final reality that will circumscribe the future of the Salish Sea, I will admit up front, is one that makes me feel uneasy because I have spent most of my career employed in the scientific enterprise. But this reality must be highlighted. Funding scientific endeavors are often perceived to be, in fact, they often are, political indulgences. More about indulgences shortly, but first, Let's do quick role play exercise here. Work with me on this, okay? Imagine that you are an elected official and you have heard the following advice. Population growth in Salish land will continue unabated. 2. Standards of living must be maintained, if not enhanced. 3. Changing climate will alter both the Salish Sea and Salish land. Now, playing your role here as an elected official, what would your response be to these 3 sobering realities? First, I will guess that you will quickly note that these are very unpleasant alternatives far beyond your mandate as an elected official. Second, you are most certain that you don't want to talk substantively about them now or ever. And third, as a person who will be facing voters soon, you absolutely want to change the topic. But there is more. As an elected official now, and be honest, your instinct would be to give the public something that shows that you care, something that demonstrates you are responsive, something that will make the voters feel better. That something is often science. It may be research, it may be demo projects, it may be commissioning panels of eminent scientists, but funding scientific endeavors implicitly provides the public with what it desires. For example, people generally want wild salmon to prosper, but people also want modern highways, and people want state-of-the-art airports, and people want cheap, reliable electricity, and people want reasonably priced housing surrounded by at least a little land. But the reality of these, that few people ever want to make unpleasant choices in favor of wild salmon. How many elected officials candidly tell voters that they can't have it all? The fact is, well-funded and highly visible science activities often do hide unpleasant policy trade-offs. This is a time-tested human behavior, avoiding tough, contentious, unpopular policy choices by sponsoring noble deeds. There are many examples from the past. Think about European history 500 or 600 years ago for the classic and most famous example. When people sinned in those long ago days, some representatives of the church offered indulgences to cleanse the sin for a price to be paid to the church. The good news, sinners felt better about their past bad behavior, and the church was pleased to receive the much needed cash. Pretty much everyone was happy with this arrangement. How similar is this long ago system to the modern tactic of funding science that really doesn't fix the problem? For the most part, elected officials feel good, most members of the public feel good, and of course, as a funded scientist myself, I always felt good. Okay, there you have it. My take on the 4 realities that will principally circumscribe the future of the Salish Sea for the rest of this century. These realities should not be categorized as doom and gloom, and they should surely not be examples of irrational exuberance. Rather, they are simply blunt, unvarnished appraisals of the future, perhaps troubling to some, but my guess is that they ring true for most of you. I'll conclude with a prediction and offer an opportunity, especially an opportunity for those early in their careers. Any strategy targeted to change the future ecological direction of the Salish Sea must respond to these 4 realities, or that strategy will not succeed. It will be added to an already long list of prior, noble, and earnest, and failed strategies. Look down the road to the end of this century, to 2100, less than 9 decades away, only several dozen generations of salmon beyond today's runs, just a few Pacific decadal oscillations from now, to a time when Salish land's population will probably be triple or more than today's levels. Even given all this, there are still policy options that are likely to be ecologically viable and probably socially acceptable, but the range of options continues to narrow. If, and this is a big if society genuinely wishes to change the current ecological trajectory of the Salish Sea, then most of us here know that these four realities must change. As unwelcome as it may be, the public needs to hear the same message. Thank you.